Welcome to the fourth part of a 5-part podcast series on this year's book for Visitation Parish, Stranger God by Richard Beck. Today we're going to focus on part 4, which covers chapters 13, 14, and 15. I'm Lorraine Gordon, a Visitation parishioner and member of the Faith Formation team, and with me is Father Patrick Rush, our former pastor who still occasionally celebrates Mass at Visitation. He's graciously agreed to participate in a question and answer format for our unedited podcast series. Father Bott, thank you for taking part in this experiment. Your recommendation clearly influenced the Faith Formation team's choice. Now that you and I have discussed more than half of this book, do you still feel strongly about its value?
I do feel strongly about its value, and the reason the locus of my feeling strongly about the value is where we are in the book at this point. Both part 3 and part 4, as well as the final part 5, really get us into the how-to of the practice of this spirituality that Dr. Beck is espousing. And I think the fact that we have a how-to, we have a roadmap to that spirituality is very important and very much the value that this book brings.
I agree, and I think it was also personally important for Richard to establish a guide, path to this, because in the previous part, he had been sort of embarrassed by the fact that he could talk about hospitality, but he couldn't really tell people how to practice it. Mm-hmm. And now he has a way of actually doing that he thinks is quite helpful.
And I would like to add, this is my second or third time through the book. I don't know, yours probably fifth or sixth,
yeah,
whatever.
Right.
But it's a book worth going back to. It's something that will sink in more and more as we go back to it. So I am for myself setting a goal that I will try to review this book at least annually.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that others might find helpful too.
We are actually sort of placing the book discussion sessions in February as a sort of pre-Lenten spiritual warm-up, and speaking of warm-up, one thing we didn't mention in podcast 3 is that often when people, and this is the beauty of having Therese as a model, but often people say, well, read about this saint and you go do whatever this saint does.
Right.
And he says it's like saying, okay, there's an NBA three-pointer, you shoot like him.
Right.
And it doesn't work that way, right? There's just this gradual, slow, sometimes frustrating exercise that develops us to the point where we can even get the ball in the basket, much less do a three-pointer.
And it's developing a habit,
right.
And you develop a habit slowly. And we did speak about that one example that Therese gives of the nun who is an irritant because of the noise she makes. We don't necessarily have to get to that level where we consider that a concert to God.
Yeah, right.
But at least it sets for us goals as we continue to develop this hospitality in our lives.
One of the ways in which I think Richard makes this so relevant to us and accessible, is probably the best word, is to actually use experiences that he's had. And he begins chapter 13 of part 4 with a focus on a woman named Abir. And do you want to talk about sort of the emotional triggers that she calls up in her community and maybe how her story is relevant today?
Well, she is a strange woman, at least from the point of view of they don't know her. And she's wearing a hijab, I guess it's called, a headpiece covering. And so at this time of fear of terrorists and so forth, the people around her in the town in Texas, West Texas, find her to be off-putting. But she's got a family, she's got kids and a husband. And so a couple of the soccer moms reach out to her, and in the process of that, find her to be a person like themselves. So they stop, they look, they welcome in, and they discover a person who is not a threat, but one to whom they should share hospitality and one who shares hospitality with them.
Right. I think he also uses her as an example of split vision, kind of schizophrenic vision. On the one hand, you can look at her, she's a strange woman speaking with a strange accent, wearing a hijab, which we might then associate with terrorism or whatever. And then the other way we can look at her is that she's a lonely mom struggling to adapt to an unfamiliar environment with kids who play soccer.
And she is, again, an icon of a wider group. I mean, she, for example, is an Arab, I presume, or somebody from there.
She's from Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia, yeah. But it could be somebody who is a stranger to us because of gender, because of race, because of ethnicity, even because of locale, because we're talking about visiting people in prisons. This woman, it becomes a symbol of all those people who, at first blush, may be threats to us, but who, as we stop and welcome, become friends and become persons and become Christ to us.
Yeah, he speaks to the scene when I think the family has a 1-year commitment. I believe it's her husband who is studying under Richard to write his master's thesis, and he's like the star pupil for Richard, so that's kind of ironic. But that when they leave after a year, these people are weeping because they've grown close, and that happens in just 1 year. So how do you think that's relevant today? Can you kind of think of scenarios in which we sort of do the same thing? We have that sort of schizophrenic vision of people.
It can be because of the group to which they belong, the race, the ethnicity, or whatever. But it can also be just because of there's someone that, for whatever reason, is somewhat off-putting to us. So as he gives the process of developing this habit, his first step is apologize to someone. And his second step is reach out to someone that you haven't reached out to before. Somebody at the office, somebody in the neighborhood. Get to know that person, say some kind words to that person. So this becomes, for us, a process. It starts to lay out a process that we follow in this regard.
When I read this and I read about Abir, I was thinking about the many videos we're seeing now of refugees from Central America, and again, there's that split vision. Either we see these people as gang members or disease-laden aliens, or we can see them as desperate mothers, fathers, and children looking for protection. And I think, again, it's, to the extent that we know these people, that changes our perception of them. And I think last Wednesday evening's supper series, where the delegation to El Salvador spoke about how when they see those videos, they think of people they know. They think of people they've become friends with and are close to. And I just think that, as we've said so many times, it's the idea of if they're in your circle of affection, that changes everything. Mm-hmm. So I do want to mention, I've been reading, I read the Jesuit magazine America, which is published nationally, and there was an article recently in November written about the caravan from Central America, and one of our parishioners, Kristen Heyer, who is the daughter of Bob Heyer and the late Jean Marie Hiesberger, writes very compellingly about that sort of tension between what we see, what we know, what we're close to, what's proximate in our lives. So I thought, that's obviously very much on people's minds these days when we see so many images of that, either on the front page of a newspaper, but more commonly on some kind of a screen.
And Richard develops that idea of seeing, the importance of seeing the person, not just the prototype, not just seeing the threat, not just seeing whatever is off-putting, but behind that, seeing the person. And I think that's what happened with Abir, the woman in West Texas, and so forth. The other mothers got to know the person.
Right, and I think you've hit on sort of his first point, which is to actually see. He mentions a kind of an interesting study of brain scans and how sometimes we can be looking at people and we don't see them. We either look through them, we look past them, we don't see them, and that's actually, documented physiologically that people do that. And so he says what this means is that hospitality begins with seeing people. You can't welcome people if you don't see them. And again, this whole idea of a practice of attention, you have to pay attention to something. It means staying alert. And, I think of that, how often sometimes I see people talking to one another, and one of the people talking will be looking around the room or, looking at his or her watch, and you can tell that is not an engaged listener at all. It's just this, and that's what I like about this book. It informs so many of the situations that I find myself in. I sort of think, oh, wow, the light bulb goes off, and I think this is exactly what Richard was writing about. Mm-hmm. So that happens a lot.
And he applies that seeing, I've applied it, you've applied it to people who are quite different from ourselves, but he applies it to dealing with the checkout person, mm-hmm. with the ticket agent, mm-hmm. Just with the people we deal with day in and day out, and when we're in a hurry, or when we're just out to purchase whatever it is we're purchasing, or whatever that is, we fail to see the person.
Yeah, he has a big deal about checkout lines, or lines
of
queuing up.
He must do a lot of shopping.
He must do a lot of shopping. Well, I think he also does a lot of flying, because the example that you're mentioning is where his flight has been delayed. He's at the airport. His flight has been delayed, then canceled. So there's long queue forms, to get a hotel room, to do new connections, etc. And what I thought, he tries to make the case, and I'll ask you if you think he's convincing, that people are disgruntled, they're angry, they're tired, they're hungry, they have to stand in line, because if they forfeit a place, then they go, then they won't have a place to stay that night. And he says this is not an ordeal as much as it is an opportunity. Did you buy that argument?
I do buy that argument. And remember, earlier in the book he gave the example of being at a restaurant, mm-hmm. and how you would respond to a waitress or waiter who is a friend of yours, but is overwhelmed and not responding to you as quickly as you might like. And would that be different from responding to a waitress or waiter who you don't know, but not accomplishing it as quickly as you might like? So he takes it into a number of different venues of our lives and says, now, every one of these presents you with an opportunity to extend hospitality.
Right. And, he talks about how the practice of seeing the ticket agent in the midst of your fatigue and anger and letting your kindness carve a space out where she's actually protected. And I think, that clearly is a scenario. The scenario that occurred to me just recently was I was on the phone, I was calling my carrier. And so, you go through the 800 or 888 number, you get an impossible number of menus. By the time you're actually talking to a human being, you were so frustrated, you're beyond patience. And lots of times that person you're talking to is, half a world away, speaking with an accent. And I think it's so much more tempting there to be unkind, because there isn't a room full of people listening to you being, chewing out a ticket agent. Mm-hmm. And it's just, I just thought this is another opportunity to be kind to someone, who, and, in temptation, you don't see this person. So, you're like miles and miles apart. I thought this is another opportunity. This would be the kind of opportunity that Richard would use to be kind to someone.
So I think the practicality of that is focusing not on what it is we want to accomplish, but the fact that we're dealing with a person, and seeing that. And I think also we don't want to forget the idea that we have to slow down a bit. We have to slow down a bit in accomplishing our goals, whatever those may be, in order to practice being present and available to a person.
Well, of course, and that brings us to the one parable that I thought was an obvious choice, which is the Good Samaritan, and how he alludes to it, which we would have expected, but he sort of uses it in a unique way to emphasize the important aspect of stopping. Mm-hmm. Do you remember how he does that?
Well, it's as you say, it's an experiment given at theological school, where
Princeton no less. Okay,
yes.
All right.
Where the students in class are divided, and some are told they're going to give a talk on the parable of the Good Samaritan next. Others are not told that. Some are told they have to get to their next class where they give that talk immediately. Others are not told that. They're told they have plenty of time and so forth. And so then they all set out, and there is a man in need that they pass. Literally.
Slumped and moaning.
Yes.
Yes.
And they watch how the various ones respond. Some do, some don't. One of the characteristics of those who do not is the ones who were told they have to get to their class right away to give that talk, move right on.
Right.
Some of the ones who were not told that do stop, some do not stop. But time and the need to comply with a schedule seems to be somewhat normative. So that's when he goes into, we just have to slow down. We have to slow down in our lives.
Right, and I thought it was interesting that he chose seminarians. And
From Princeton.
From Princeton, no less, right? And that, that the idea is that time was really the most important factor. And the idea of slowing down, he actually alludes to a Japanese theologian who says that slowness is the pace of God's love. It is different from the technological speed to which we're accustomed. One thing I remember reading this and rereading it was, I had never thought of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that the person we might identify Jesus with is not the Good Samaritan, but the man who is beaten and left to die. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's always Jesus would be the Good Samaritan, because the sort of antipathy that Jews had towards Samaritans, and that he's the one more likely than the priest and the scribe to help the person in need. But had you ever looked at the Good Samaritan?
Well, I'm blessed to have had a lot of experiences with Ignatian spirituality, and St. Ignatius is the one who suggests bringing the imagination into prayer. And Ignatius would say, in any gospel story like this, you identify with all the various characters and just see. So yeah, that has crossed my mind because of my background in Ignatian spirituality.
Okay. Well, I think his point is that when we're engaged with people, that we have to face them, we have to stay relaxed, we have to be present, and we really have to work at listening, which I think sometimes is harder to do than we realize. And he refers to these seminarians, and I think the phrase could apply to us sometimes as well, as Jesus hobbyists.
Yes.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he means that we do it when it's easy to do and we don't do it when it's tough to do. However, I would not take that too disparagingly, because we're learning, we're growing. So if you're a Jesus hobbyist when you first start this spirituality, that's okay. If 10 years later you're still a Jesus hobbyist, that's not okay.
Right. And I like his Jesus will make you late.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good thing to remember, particularly when you have encounters with
and
people.
Also his statement that we have to be interruptible.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
We have to allow other people to interrupt our project or whatever.
So returning to the little flower, there's one final aspect of hospitality that she thinks is crucial, and she develops that by kind of looking at the sisters around. She sort of sees and stops, and then what's the final step? What does she do?
Well, she becomes proactive.
Yeah.
She seeks out. She finds a nun in her community that, for whatever reason, seems to be an outsider, and reaches out. And he applies that then, that we have to do the same in the various communities that we find ourselves. Right.
She actually says, I must seek out, that this is the third step that she feels morally compelled. And no more, and he says, no more detours. Which is, which again, I do in the grocery store.
Excuses
I do,
all right.
Well, no, I literally, I'll go to the next aisle.
Yeah.
Thank you, before I have to stop and talk.
But just to summarize, the first step is to stop.
Well, it's to see, I think.
To see.
See.
Second step is to stop.
Right.
Third step is to reach out.
Approach. Right, okay. And, when he talks about approaching people, he finds that he'll find himself in a situation, and he'll look around and he'll say, who's not being noticed? And I think this is sort of the way in which you find Richard, of course, finding himself friends with Christy and people like her who are, who've been marginalized. So as I was reading this, I wondered if Richard risked losing some of his readers when he writes this. This is a direct quote. A whole other world of friendships has opened up to me. Today, I spend less time with the middle-class folk and people with PhDs, and more time with inmates and people with cognitive disabilities. What do you think?
Well, I can't comment on Richard's change of friendships and so forth, but I don't know that we have to see that as where this will take us. Certainly we will, I'm sure, reach out to people differently, include in our moral circle people whom we hadn't included before. And but I don't know that we're going to necessarily feel that we're going to have to replace all of our social contacts with different social contacts.
I think some of this comes from his desire to emulate people like Dorothy Day.
Yeah.
And that to
Who
me
was total in her dedication.
very much so, and much more. He is much more, in the true sense of the word, radical in that sense, where he really, it's like an entire sort of giving over. And again, going back to Therese, she could not be radical in the way Joan of Arc was radical, or she couldn't be radical in the way Francis of Assisi was radical. And I think that we also cannot always be as radical in terms of that, but it's getting closer to opening up our circle of affection.
Correct.
So that and so I don't think this should be threatening to anyone.
I agree.
I think it's really important. Okay, so in kind of summary, in part 4, seeing, stopping, and approaching, Richard has honed our regimen of hospitality down to 3 crucial steps. As listeners, let's ask ourselves, who is someone I normally wouldn't speak to? Whom am I not seeing? Am I making the time to stop? Do I have the courage to reach out and, by approaching, touch the life of someone I might have totally ignored or overlooked? We've come to the conclusion of our 4th podcast on the Stranger God, and we hope that you will join us for the 5th and final podcast. The 5th one will be available next week. Once again, I want to thank Father Pat for recommending the book and for participating today, and for Teresa Albright, who makes all this happen. The Faith Formation team would love your feedback on this and other podcasts, so please feel free to leave a comment. We hope these podcasts might inspire you to attend our book discussion sessions in February as a pre-Lenten spiritual exercise. Thank you very much for listening.